Welcome. This video will be quite long considering that I'm covering 7 chapters, important questions, quotes, and essays, or whatever may be applicable for these first 7 chapters. We'll be going through in detail and look at all the quotes which are likely to come in the exam from the exam point of view for first year BA LLB semester 1. Mumbai University. Let's start with chapter 1, The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare. In Act 4, Scene 1, this is the chapter that we are covering of William Shakespeare, The Merchant of Venice. Several quotes and themes are essential for examination preparation. Let's look at the first one. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. So they will give us this quote and tell us who spoke this and under what context, or maybe explain this statement or this quote. So this was spoken by Portia, and she was disguised as a lawyer Balthazar, Balthasar. Portia appeals to Shylock to show mercy towards Antonio, Antonio, and Shylock's spelling is Shylok, emphasizing that mercy is a divine attribute that benefits both the giver and the receiver. Let's look at the quote again. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. That is, Portia appeals to Shylock to show mercy towards Antonio, emphasizing that mercy is a divine attribute that benefits both the giver and the receiver. This is one of the important quotes of the chapter Merchant of Venice. Next, you take my life when you do take the means whereby I live. If you had read the chapter, the videos that I have made from 1 to 13, in that this quote is also there. It states that you take my life when you do take the means whereby I live. Speaker is Shylock. Shylock laments that stripping him or taking away his wealth is equivalent to taking his life, as his livelihood depends on his assets. Now, when he lost the case against Antonio, the laws of that time stated that whosoever takes or attempts to take life of a Venetian citizen will be stripped away of his wealth. All his wealth will be taken away. Half of his wealth will go to the person whose life was in danger, and half will go to the state. And when he lost, the Duke pronounced that half his wealth will go to Antonio and half to the state. And on that basis, he stated this line: You take my life when you do take the means whereby I live. I'm content. This is again a quote by Shylock. After being outmanured in court and facing the loss of his wealth and forced conversion to Christianity, Shylock resigns himself to his fate with this statement. Antonio: I am married to a wife which is as dear to me as life itself. But life itself, my wife, and all the world are not with me esteemed above thy life. This is spoken by Bassanio. Bassanio expresses his deep friendship and loyalty to Antonio, stating that he values Antonio's life above his own life, his wife, and the world. Tarry a little, there is something else. Tarry means wait. So, speaker is Portia. Explanation is Portia, still in disguise as Balthazar, interrupts Shylock as he is about to claim his pound of flesh, indicating that she has found a flaw in his legal claim. Now let's look at few question answers. What argument does Portia make for Shylock showing mercy? Portia argues that mercy is a divine quality that blesses both the giver and the receiver. This is one of the important sentences that I feel that we should remember, because it's not only a wonderful sentence but also uh, I feel is very likely to come in the question, because this is one of the highlights of Merchant of Venice. She suggests that showing mercy would elevate Shylock's character and align him with God's attributes. What loophole does Portia find in Shylock's bond? Answer. Portia points out that while the bond allows Shylock to remove a pound of Antonio's flesh, it does not permit him to shed any of Antonio's blood. Since it's impossible to take flesh without shedding blood, Shylock cannot legally enforce the bond. This is also one of the key key questions of the chapter, or key highlights of this entire play of William Shakespeare. What penalty does Shylock face for seeking Antonio's life? Answer. Shylock is found guilty of conspiring against a Venetian citizen's life, which results in the forfeiture of his wealth and a sentence that could include death. However, Antonio intervenes, suggesting that Shylock's life be spared, but that he must convert to Christianity and bequeath or give away half his wealth to his daughter Jessica and her husband Lorenzo. Why does Portia, disguised as Balthazar, ask for Bassanio's ring? Answer. Portia tests Bassanio's loyalty by requesting the ring she had given him, which he had vowed never to part with. This test assesses Bassanio's fidelity and the value he places on his promises. Let's move on to chapter 2, Joseph Andrews. Let's go look at the five important quotes from Book 4, Chapter 2 and 3 of Joseph Andrews by Henry Fielding. This is what is covered for our syllabus for semester 1 in Law and Literature. First, Lady Booby confronts Parson Adams. Do you mean to affront me by supporting Joseph's folly? This showcases Lady Booby's indignation and her opposition to Joseph and Fanny's relationship. So basically, the quote that can come is only this much, and we have to state that it was said by Lady Booby, and it was told while talking to Parson Adams. She said this, and this was said to because she was opposing the marriage of Joseph and Fanny. She did not want them to marry. That is why she stated that, do you mean to affront me by supporting Joseph's folly? Because Parson Adams was supporting Joseph when Lady Booby said that Joseph is a vagabond. Vagabond means like a lafanga kind of thing. So that is what it is. So we'll move on to the next one. Adams replied, I act according to my conscience and answer to God, not to men. So the only quote that will come is, I act according to my conscience and answer to God, not to men. This was stated by Adam. Parson Adam, to be correct, precise, his full name is Parson Adams. I act according to my conscience and answer to God, not to men. This was told to Lady Booby by Parson Adams. This highlights Adams' moral integrity and his steadfastness in adhering to his principles. When Lady Booby told him not to go ahead with conducting the marriage of Joseph and Fanny, there he states that, she also tells Lady Booby also tells Parson Adams that She will instruct his master to remove him from his service. And on that, Parson Adams states that I act according to my conscience and answer to God, not to men. Third, she resolved to gratify her inclinations, thinking she owed herself the debt of pleasure. This reveals Lady Booby's self indulgent nature and inner conflict. Virtue is a jewel far beyond the reach of wealth or power. This was stated by Parson Adams. He believed in virtue over material or spatial influence, and that is evident here. Virtue is a jewel far beyond the reach of wealth or power. Adams said, true happiness lies in contentment, not in riches or lustful pursuits. It emphasizes the novel's recurring theme of true happiness versus superficial pleasure. Let's go through a few question answers. What is Lady Booby's main concern about Joseph and Fanny's relationship? Lady Booby fears that their marriage will harm her reputation and undermine her authority, as she considers Joseph beneath her socially. Second question. How does Parson Adams justify his decision to publish the bans of Joseph and Fanny's marriage? Bans are basically announcements done by the church before the marriage takes place. So here Parson Adams explains that he is guided by his conscience and a sense of duty to God, not by human authority or societal pressures. What does Lady Booby contemplate after failing to stop Parson Adams? She considers other schemes to prevent the marriage, indicating her determination to sabotage the union. What moral lesson does Parson Adams impart to Lady Booby during their confrontation? What moral lessons does Parson Adams impart to Lady Booby during their confrontation? He emphasizes, that is, Parson Adams emphasizes that virtue and happiness stem from contentment and integrity, not from wealth or power. How does this chapter reflect the theme of class and social status in the novel? Answer. The conflict between Lady Booby and Joseph highlights the rigid class distinctions of the time, with Lady Booby looking down on Joseph and attempting to control his future. Okay. Lady Booby's confrontation with Parson Adams. They may tell us to write a short note on that. Lady Booby confronts, because the entire chapter is the confrontation between Lady Booby and Parson Adams. So Lady Booby confronts Parson Adams, criticizing him for supporting the union, that is a marriage between Joseph and Fanny. She disparages both individuals, that is puts them down, labeling Joseph a vagabond and expressing disdain, that is disgust, for Fanny. Lady Booby demands that Adams, that is Parson Adams, halt the publication of their marriage bans. That is the announcement of the marriage bans means announcements, threatening his position if he refuses. Parson Adams, however, defends the couple's virtue and insists that poverty is not a valid reason to prevent their marriage. He remains steadfast, stating he will proceed with the marriage unless presented with a legitimate reason to do otherwise. Lady Booby's consultation with Lawyer Scout. Now, there are two conversations of Lady Booby with Parson Adams and with Lawyer Scott in the entire chapter given to us in semester 1. So, these are the main two discussions that had taken place. Now, what did Lady Booby speak with Lawyer Scout? Determined to stop the marriage, Lady Booby consults Lawyer Scout, seeking legal means to prevent Joseph and Fanny from settling in her parish. Parish means in her land. Scout acknowledges that in her area basically. Scout acknowledges that by law the couple can marry. That is, he is the lawyer, Scout. So he says that they can marry. However, he suggests that with Lady Booby's influence and wealth, they can manipulate the situation to their advantage. He implies that the law often bends in favor of the affluent, indicating that is the rich, affluent is the rich, indicating a willingness to use legal technicalities to achieve Lady Booby's desires. This chapter, the chapter highlights themes of social class, the misuse of power, and the manipulation of legal systems by the wealthy to serve their interests. Lady Booby's actions underscore her determination to control those she deems beneath her, while Parson Adams embodies integrity and moral steadfastness in the face of such pressures. Let's move on to chapter 3, Pickwick Papers. In chapter 12, 13, and 34, these are the chapters from the book Pickwick Papers of Charles Dickens. Several significant quotes and events stand out. I have selected a few of them down below. Let's start with chapter 12. The quote is, "Would it be more expensive to keep two people than to keep one?" This was said by Mr. Pickwick to Mrs. Bardell when he was intending to hire a manservant, that is Mr. Sam Wellers. Mrs. Bardell misconstrues, that is misunderstands, this as a marriage proposal, leading to a comedic misunderstanding. In this, Mr. Pickwick is talking to Mrs. Bardell, Bardell. Quote, next quote is, "She was in a state of hysterical excitement." Mrs. Bardell reacts emotionally to what she believes is Mr. Pickwick's proposal for marriage. This reaction sets the stage for the ensuing, that is the oncoming legal trouble between her and Mr. Pickwick. Here, the character involved are Mr. Pickwick and Mrs. Bardell. Because when you say she was in a state of hysterical excitement, it was said by Mr. Pickwick to his friends, Mr. Snodgrass and others. Mr. Pickwick's apartment in Goswell Street were not only of a very neat and comfortable description, but peculiarly adapted for the residence of a man of his genius and observation. This is the speaker is the narrator or the author, Charles Dickens. And the context is that this is the opening line which sets the stage for Mr. Pickwick's character, highlighting his appreciation for order and his observant nature. Next, he paced the room to and fro. He paced the room to and fro with hurried steps. Paced means walked. Popped his head out of the window at intervals of about 3 minutes each, constantly referred to his watch, and exhibited many other manifestations of impatience very unusual with him. Again, it's the author narrating with what is happening, describing what is happening in the room. This description illustrates Mr. Pickwick's unusual restlessness, indicating that he is anticipating an important event. Normally, he is not so restless, or he is very calm and composed in his manners. It was evident that something of great importance was in contemplation, but what that something was, not even Mrs. Bardell had been able to discover. Once again, this is the author narrating what is happening in the chapter, in the novel, in the book. This line emphasizes the mystery surrounding Mr. Pickwick's actions, suggesting that he is preparing for a significant personal undertaking. Something big is going to happen in his life. Something significant is going to happen. What is the significance of Mr. Pickwick's unusual behavior in this chapter? Mr. Pickwick's restlessness and anticipation suggest that he is preparing for a significant personal endeavor. This behavior marks a departure from his unusual, composed demeanor, that is, his attitude, indicating a pivotal moment moment in his life. Pivotal means a main moment in his life, important moment in his life. How does the setting of Mr. Pickwick's apartment reflect his character? The neat and comfortable description of his apartments, particularly the first floor front sitting room and second floor front bedroom, mirrors Mr. Pickwick's orderly and observant nature. His living space is meticulously arranged, aligning with his methodical approach to life. This seems to be an important question. Character sketch of Mr. Pickwick. What role does Mrs. Bardell play in this chapter? Mrs. Bardell, Mr. Pickwick's landlady, observes his unusual behavior but remains unaware of his intentions. Her presence highlights the contrast between Mr. Pickwick's private plans and normalcy of his daily interactions. How does Dickens use foreshadowing in this chapter? Dickens employs Mr. Pickwick's restlessness and the mysterious nature of his actions to foreshadow a significant event in his life. The chapter builds suspense, leading readers to anticipate a forthcoming development that will impact Mr. Pickwick's journey. Now, from chapter 13, let's look at the quotes. Never was such a contest known. Now, we don't have a detailed, although this particular chapter talks about the election that is going to happen or that is happening, but it is not covered in our syllabus. Yet, we'll go through them just to be sure that if something comes, we can write. Quote is, never was such a contest known. Now this is an election happening in Evansville, and our book is not covering this. Only the letter from Dodson and Fogg, which is shown to Pickwick, Mr. Pickwick, is read in this particular chapter. But this is quite a big chapter, so we'll cover that. So quote is, never was such a contest known. The narrator describes the that is the author describes the intense political election which is happening in Evansville. This highlights Dickens' satire on the fervor and absurdity of the political campaigns. Next, Mr. Pickwick, with his usual foresight and sagacity, had chosen a peculiarly desirable moment for his visit to the borough. Borough refers to a town or a district. Here, the author ironically comments on Mr. Pickwick's arrival during the chaotic election period. This showcases Mr. Pickwick's unintentional involvement in tumultuous events. Mr. Pickwick, with his usual foresight and sagacity, had chosen a peculiar. Okay, so this is. Okay, we have already done this. Let's move on to the next one. Never was such a contest known. This is this also I think we have already covered. But let's go through. The author talks about the exaggerated and comical nature of the election in Evansville, setting the tone for the satirical portrayal of political events. The town was in a state of utmost excitement. Again, this is spoken by the author. The description emphasizes the heightened emotions and the absurd level of enthusiasm exhibited by the townspeople over the election. The streets were crowded with people who were shouting and gesticulating in the most frantic manner. Again, spoken by author Charles Dickens, this vivid imaginary illustrates the chaotic and frenzied atmosphere of the town during the election, highlighting the irrational exuberance of the populace, that is, of the population. The two parties were so equally balanced that the result was considered extremely doubtful. Again, once again by the narrator, this line reflects the intense competition between the Blues and the Buffs. The Town was in a state of utmost excitement. Again, once again by the author. The description emphasizes the heightened emotions and the absurd level of enthusiasm exhibited by the townspeople over the election, highlighting the irrational exuberance of the populace. The two parties were so equally balanced that the result was considered extremely doubtful. Again, once again by the narrator. This line reflects the intense competition between the Blues and the Buffs. adding to the suspense and humor of the election proceedings. These are the two different parties or people who have stood up for the election. Mr. Pickwick, sir, we have to inform you that a writ has been issued against you at the suit of Mrs. Bardell for breach of promise of marriage. This can come, this is one of the important points of the chapter, which is included in our syllabus. This letter is from Dodson and Fogg, Dodson and Fogg. This formal notification or notice initiates the legal proceedings against Mr. Pickwick, setting the stage for ensuing courtroom drama. This one is important. We are, sir, your obedient servants, Dodson and Fogg. This is also important. A letter from Dodson and Fogg. This is the closing remark of the letter, which reflects the impersonal and transactional nature of the legal profession as portrayed by Dickens. Now let's go through a few question and answers. How does Dickens use satire to critique political partisanship? Dickens satirizes political partisanship by depicting the town of Eatanswill as a microcosm of exaggerated political rivalry. The townspeople's blind allegiance to their respective parties, the Blues and the Buffs, lead to absurd behaviors and conflicts over trivial matters. This portrayal mocks the fervent and often irrational nature of political divisions, highlighting the pettiness and lack of substantive discourse in political engagements. Now, we are reading through so many questions and answers, but we can write it in our own way, whatever we remember or whatever comes to us naturally once, because this we can expand on the storyline in our own ways, in our own words. What role does the media play in the political climate of Eatanswill? The media in Eatanswill, represented by the two newspapers, the Eatanswill Gazette and the Eatanswill Independent, exacerbated the political tensions by publishing biased and inflammatory content that fuels the rivalry between the Blues and the Buffs. Each newspaper supports one faction, spreading misinformation and stirring up the populace, thereby demonstrating the media's power in shaping public opinion and escalating conflicts. In what ways does the election of Eatanswill reflect the broader societal attitudes of the time? The election of Eatanswill reflects the broader societal attitudes of the time by highlighting the deep-seated divisions and trivialization of serious political discourse. The townspeople's obsession with party loyalty over rational debate mirrors the real-world political climate, where allegiance to party lines often overshadowed critical thinking and constructive dialogue. Charles Dickens uses this setting to critique the superficial and divisive nature of political engagement in the 19th century Britain. And till date it has not changed. It is the same even today also. What does Mr. Pickwick's involvement in Eatanswill election contribute to the narrative? How is he involved? Mr. Pickwick's involvement in the Eatanswill election serves as a vehicle for Charles Dickens to explore and satirize the political landscape of the time. Through Mr. Pickwick's interactions with the local politicians and his observations of the election proceedings, readers gain insight into the absurdities and corruptions inherent in the political system. This involvement also adds to the comedic elements of the narrative, as Mr. Pickwick's naivety and good intentions often lead to humorous situations. What is the significance of the letter from Dodson and Fogg in the narrative? The letter serves as a catalyst or as a starting point for the legal conflict, as a notice for the legal conflict that becomes central to the plot. It introduces the theme of legal manipulation and the exploitation of individuals by unscrupulous lawyers, highlighting Dickens' critique of the legal system. How does Mr. Pickwick react upon receiving the letter? Mr. Pickwick is initially bewildered and distressed by the unexpected legal action. His reaction underscores his naivety and the contrast between his optimistic nature and the harsh realities of the legal world. What role do Dodson and Fogg play in the story? Dodson and Fogg are portrayed as opportunistic and unscrupulous lawyers who exploit Mrs. Bardell's situation for financial gain. They manipulate the legal process, demonstrating Dickens' criticism of the legal profession's potential for exploitation. How does Dickens use a lawsuit to satirize the legal system? Through the lawsuit, Dickens satirizes the legal system by depicting it as a mechanism for exploitation and profit rather than justice. The portrayal of Dodson and Fogg as manipulative and self-serving highlights the potential for abuse within the legal profession. Chapter 34. Quote, Gentlemen of the jury, are you all agreed upon your verdict? The judge addresses the jury during the trial between Mrs. Bardell and Mr. Pickwick. This moment leads to the pivotal verdict against Mr. Pickwick. The characters involved are the judge and the jury. Next quote is, I would rather go to prison than pay these damages. This was stated by Mr. Pickwick, who expresses his indignation, his frustration after the unfavorable verdict. The statement underscores his principles and sets the stage for his subsequent actions. Here, characters involved are Mr. Pickwick. The court was full and the trial was going to begin. There was a great deal of bustle in the court as the attorneys settled themselves down at their desks, and the judge, who had an enormous wig, looked at the papers before him. This is spoken by the narrator, the author. The context is that this quote sets the scene for the trial. It introduces the typical, almost comical atmosphere of a court with its bustling activity, exaggerated formality, and elaborate costumes, all contributing to the farcical nature of the proceedings. Now, gentlemen of the jury, I am going to address you in a very few words. I shall ask you to consider the evidence of the case, and question you are to decide is whether the defendant did or did not make a promise of marriage to the plaintiff. Next. Now, gentlemen of the jury, I am going to address you in a very few words. I shall ask you to consider the evidence of the case, and the question you are to decide is whether the defendant did or did not make a promise of marriage to the plaintiff. The speaker is Mr. Dodson, speaking to the jury. This line marks Dodson's role in the trial, where he begins the legal argument. As a representative of the plaintiffs, his language is formal and direct, attempting to sway the jury. Dickens mocks the overly serious tone of legal rhetoric, making it sound mechanical and detached from the actual matter at hand. Next, the defendant, Mr. Pickwick, is an individual whose character is well known. His honesty, integrity, and general good-naturedness are beyond reproach. The speaker is Mr. Pickwick's counsel. This quote comes from Mr. Pickwick's defense. It reflects how his counsel tries to build a case around Pickwick's moral character, emphasizing the contrast between Pickwick's good-heartedness and the frivolity of the charges brought against him. Mr. Pickwick is a man of the most unsuspecting nature, and the idea that he could have intended any harm to Mrs. Bardell is absolutely preposterous. Speaker is Mr. Pickwick's counsel. This quote speaks to the defense strategy, attempting to paint Mr. Pickwick as innocent and too naive to have any intention of hurting Mrs. Bardell. This statement indirectly critiques Pickwick's character as one who lacks the sophistication to deal with deceit or manipulation, which is central to the plot. You are charged with having made a promise to marry Mrs. Bardell. Can you deny this, Mr. Pickwick? Speaker, the judge to Mr. Pickwick. This is a crucial moment in the trial when the judge directly questions Mr. Pickwick. It underscores the central issue of the case, whether or not Mr. Pickwick made a promise of marriage to Mrs. Bardell. Mr. Pickwick, you are guilty of the charge, but the court will take your exemplary character and good faith into consideration. Speaker is the judge. The context is that this statement illustrates the verdict of the trial. Mr. Pickwick is technically guilty of breach of promise. The judge expresses some leniency because of Pickwick's generally good character. Dickens uses this moment to poke fun at how legal systems sometimes render decisions that are more than formality than justice. Let's go through a few question answers. How does Dickens satirize the legal system in this chapter? Dickens satirizes the legal system by portraying the trial as a comically exaggerated event, full of pomp but lacking genuine concern for justice. The lawyers, Dodson and Fogg, are portrayed as manipulative, exploiting Mrs. Bardell's case for profit. The legal proceedings themselves are marked by formality and absurdity, with the judge and the lawyers adhering to legal rituals that seem disconnected from the human aspect of the case. Through this, Dickens critiques how the legal system can prioritize procedure over actual fairness and justice. Additionally, the portrayal of the trial as an event of great public spectacle mocks the tendency for legal dramas to be treated as entertainment. What role does Mrs. Bardell's character play in the trial, and how is she presented? Mrs. Bardell is presented as the accuser in the case, and while she may be seen as a victim of Mr. Pickwick's alleged broken promise, Dickens portrays her as a character who manipulates the situation for financial gain. She is depicted as an opportunistic woman who is not entirely motivated by justice but by the possibility of a financial reward. Her character is used to highlight the absurdity of the case, as her actions are portrayed as overblown and exaggerated, much like the trial itself. Her manipulation of the legal system mirrors the exploitation seen in the legal proceedings and societal attitudes of the time. Why is Mr. Pickwick's character significant in this trial? And how does it influence the outcome? Mr. Pickwick's character is central to the trial, as it is his actions or supposed actions that are under scrutiny. His naivety, good-heartedness, and lack of understanding of the consequences of his behavior are key to the narrative. His innocence is the reason why the trial becomes comical, as he doesn't seem to grasp the gravity of the situation or the legal system's capacity for exploitation. His exemplary character is what ultimately influences the judge's decision to show some leniency, despite the fact that he technically is guilty of breaching the promise. Dickens uses Mr. Pickwick's character to critique the legal system's reliance on formalities rather than genuine moral judgment. What does Dickens reveal about the nature of justice through this trial? Dickens reveals that the nature of justice in the legal system is often based more on formality, status, and character rather than actual moral truth. Despite Mr. Pickwick's innocence in the emotional and ethical sense, he is still legally guilty of breaching a promise. The trial itself is more about legal procedures, biases, and profit making than it is about achieving real justice. Dickens uses this trial to show how the legal system can be manipulated and how the focus on procedures can obscure genuine moral accountability. The fact that Mr. Pickwick is found guilty, despite his innocence in the heart of the matter, reveals the absurdity of relying solely on legal technicalities. How does Dickens create humor in the depiction of the trial? Dickens creates humor in the depiction of the trial by exaggerating the seriousness with which the proceedings are conducted, while the actual issues at hand are trivial. The pomp and formality of the courtroom, paired with the absurdity of the case, result in a comedic contrast. The lawyers, especially Dodson and Fogg, are portrayed as greedy, self-serving individuals who treat the trial as an opportunity for personal gain rather than for seeking justice. Additionally, Mr. Pickwick's confusion and lack of awareness about the trial's significance add to the humor as his innocent nature clashes with the ridiculous legal environment. Next question. How does the misunderstanding between Mr. Pickwick and Mrs. Bardell in chapter 12 lead to subsequent legal complications? Mr. Pickwick innocently inquires about the expenses of hiring a servant, asking Mrs. Bardell if it would be more costly to maintain two people instead of one. Mrs. Bardell misinterprets this as a marriage proposal, leading her to react with overwhelming emotion. This misunderstanding escalates when Mr. Pickwick's friends enter the scene, finding him in a compromising position with Mrs. Bardell in his arms. The situation spirals further when Mrs. Bardell, believing she has been jilted, sues Mr. Pickwick for breach of promise of marriage. This legal action becomes a central plot point, highlighting themes of miscommunication and absurdities of the legal system. Next question. What satirical elements does Dickens employ to critique the political climate of his time? Dickens satirizes the political fervor of the Eatanswill election. He portrays the electorate as highly partisan, with citizens vehemently supporting either the Blues or the Buffs, often without a clear understanding of the issues at hand. The chaotic scenes, including public parades, heated debates, and even physical altercations, serve to mock the superficiality and performative nature of political campaigns. Through exaggerated characters and absurd situations, Dickens critiques the susceptibility of the public to political manipulation and the often farcical nature of electoral processes. Next question. How does Mr. Pickwick's reaction to the court's verdict reflect his character and principles? Upon being found guilty and ordered to pay substantial damages to Mrs. Bardell, Mr. Pickwick declares that he would prefer imprisonment over complying with what he perceives as an unjust verdict. This reaction underscores his steadfast commitment to his principles and his refusal to be coerced by a legal system he believes to be flawed. Mr. Pickwick's willingness to face incarceration rather than compromise his integrity highlights his moral fortitude and critiques the rigidity and moral ambiguities of the legal institutions of the time. Let's move on to chapter 5, Adam Bede. Let's go through the key quotes and context. Hattie Sorrel, you are guilty of the crime laid to your charge, of having by concealment and by the neglect of the laws of the nature killed your child. The speaker is a judge. This is the sentence Hattie Sorrel receives after being found guilty of murdering her newborn child. The judge's words reflect the severity and formality of the legal proceedings, as well as the emphasis placed on the idea of concealment of the crime. It also shows how the law views Hattie's actions, focusing on her neglect rather than her emotional state or intentions. You have been found guilty of an act of wickedness and must atone for it before the law. Speaker is the judge. This is another line from the judge's sentencing, further underscoring Hattie's guilt in the eyes of the law. The term wickedness reflects the harsh moral judgment society places on her actions. The trial and sentence symbolize the broader theme of justice and morality in the novel, where social and legal systems are more concerned with punishment than the context of the crime. You have been found guilty of an act of wickedness and must atone for it before the law. The speaker is the judge. This is another line from the judge's sentencing, further underscoring Hattie's guilt in the eyes of the law. The term wickedness reflects the harsh moral judgment society places on her actions. The trial and sentence symbolize the broader theme of justice and morality in the novel, where social and legal systems are more concerned with punishment than the context of the crime. I would not have done it for the world if I had known what it would be. Speaker is Hattie Sorrell. Hattie, Hetty, Sorrel, speaks these words when confronted with the consequences of her actions. She expresses her regret, but it comes too late. This statement highlights the internal conflict she experiences after realizing the severity of what she has done. Though it is clear that her actions were driven by selfishness and her own desires without fully understanding the weight of her choices. Next, I was so proud, so foolish. My heart was so full of love for him and so empty of anything else. Speaker is Hattie Sorrell. Hattie reflects on her emotional state before the tragedy. She acknowledges her pride and the shallow nature of her feelings for Arthur Donithron. Her vanity and her obsession with Arthur led to her neglect of the child, which she then murdered by abandoning it. This quote serves as a turning point where Hattie is confronted with the realization of her personal flaws and how they contributed to the crime. Next, I shall not die. I shall never die. I cannot believe it. Speaker, Hattie Sorrell. This quote occurs when Hattie is first confronted with the severity of her crime, the murder of her child, and the possibility of her own death sentence. Her denial reflects her inability to come to terms with the consequences of her actions. Hattie's self-centered nature is evident here as she focuses on her own fate, ignoring the larger moral issues of her crime. This moment of denial showcases her immaturity and emotional instability. I am not wicked. I did not mean to do harm. Speaker is Hattie Sorrell. Hattie says this is an attempt to defend herself during the trial after she has been accused of the murder of her child. This quote reveals Hattie's fundamental lack of self-awareness and understanding of the gravity of her actions. She views herself as innocent and incapable of malice, though her actions, neglecting her child and leaving it to die, are seen as morally wrong. It reflects her emotional immaturity and failure to grasp the full consequences of her behavior. If I had known what it would be, I would have died rather than it should have come to this. Speaker is Hattie Sorrell. Hattie speaks this line when she is confronted with the full ramifications of her crime, the death of her child and the loss of her future. This quote is significant because it shows Hattie's realization of the enormity of her mistake. Though it comes too late, it reveals her deep regret. But her regret is still rooted in self-pity rather than true moral reflection of her actions. Next, I shall never see him again. I shall never see him again. Hattie Sorrell speaks. Hattie expresses these words in despair after realizing that her relationship with Arthur Donitron is completely over. This marks the point where Hattie fully acknowledges that Arthur's rejection and her own mistakes have led to her social and emotional downfall. Her repeated refrain emphasizing her inability to let go of her attachment to Arthur, even as the reality of her situation becomes undeniable. It highlights Hattie's fixation on Arthur as a symbol of her failed aspirations. Let's go through some few question answers. What does Hattie's death sentence reveal about society's views on women and morality? Answer. Hattie's death sentence reflects the rigid and harsh moral standards of the society in which she lives. Women, especially in rural Victorian society, were expected to adhere to strict moral codes, particularly regarding sexuality and motherhood. Hetty's crime, though driven by her immaturity and ignorance, is judged severely because it breaks these societal norms. Her actions are not seen in terms of her personal emotional struggles or her vulnerability as a young woman, but solely as a moral failing, highlighting the limited understanding of women's experiences in this era. How does Hetty's sense of guilt evolve throughout the chapter? Answer. Hetty's sense of guilt evolves significantly in this chapter. At first, she is completely in denial about the severity of her crime, believing she did not intend to harm anyone. As the consequences become clearer and she is confronted with the reality of her actions, she begins to feel a deep sense of regret. Her statements, such as "I would not have done it for the world," show her growing realization of the gravity of what she has done. However, it is important to note that her remorse is more self centered than genuinely reflective of her understanding of the child's life she took. This demonstrates her moral immaturity and the tragic results of her naivety. What role does Arthur Donithron play in Hetty's downfall? Arthur Donithron plays a significant role in Hetty's downfall, though his involvement is indirect. Hetty's obsession with Arthur, her desire to be loved by him, and her hope that he would marry her lead her to make reckless decisions. Arthur, who had an affair with Hetty and then rejected her, is the catalyst for her emotional turmoil and isolation. Hetty's failure to get the attention she expected from him, combined with her societal rejection, drives her into an emotional state where she feels abandoned and powerless. This emotional instability ultimately leads to her desperate actions, culminating in the murder of her child. How does George Eliot use Hetty's character to explore themes of pride and vanity? George Eliot uses Hetty Sorrel's character to explore the destructive nature of vanity and pride. Hetty is portrayed as a young woman who is deeply concerned with her appearance, her relationship with Arthur, and her social standing. Her obsession with Arthur's affection blinds her to the reality of her situation and makes her neglect her responsibilities. Her pride prevents her from seeing the broader consequences of her actions and leads her to act impulsively. Hattie's downfall, which is the result of her vanity and emotional immaturity, serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of superficiality and self centeredness. How does the legal system and the concept of justice play a role in Hattie's faith? The legal system in Hattie's case represents the unforgiving nature of justice in Victorian society, particularly for women. While Hattie's actions were impulsive and rooted in ignorance and emotional distress, the legal system does not consider these factors when delivering the verdict. The focus is solely on the act itself, her concealment of the child, and her abandonment of it. The harshness of the legal response highlights the lack of empathy or understanding in the legal and social systems of the time, which were more concerned with upholding moral laws than addressing the complexities of personal suffering or emotional turmoil. This rigid application of justice reflects the broader theme of how society punishes individuals for moral transgressions without considering their context or the factors that lead them to commit the crime. Let's look at the main characters. Adam Bede. Adam is the novel's protagonist. He is a strong, moral, hard-working carpenter. Adam is depicted as a man of deep principles and much of the novel revolves around his journey of personal growth, love, and his reaction to the moral failings of those around him. Hattie Sorrel is a young, beautiful, and vain woman who works as a servant. She is the object of Adam's affections and has a tragic storyline involving her romantic relationship with Arthur Donithron. Hattie's actions lead to her downfall, and she becomes a symbol of consequences of vanity, emotional immaturity, and social isolation. Arthur Donitron. Arthur is a young, wealthy, and somewhat reckless landowner who becomes involved with Hattie Sorrel. His romantic relationship with Hattie leads to significant consequences, including the birth of her child and her eventual crime. Arthur's character is a study in privilege, moral ambiguity, and the consequences of youthful impulsiveness. On Hattie's denial and self deception, these kind of questions can come on short note, telling us to describe more on Hattie's denial and self deception. Hattie's tendency to deny the seriousness of her actions is a recurring theme in the novel. For example, in the quote, "I am not wicked, I did not mean to do harm," Hattie tries to absolve herself from responsibility. This self deception highlights her immaturity and inability to comprehend the full moral implications of her actions. Eliot uses Hattie's character to explore the consequences of vanity and self centeredness. Vanity means when one person gives too much importance to oneself, there is too much egoistic attitude. Hattie's regret and self pity. The quote, "If I had known what it would be, I would have died rather than it should have come to this," illustrates Hattie's regret, which is more about her own suffering than a true understanding of the tragedy she caused. Eliot's critique of superficial emotional responses versus genuine moral reflection. Character development. Hattie's character undergoes a shift from vanity, that is self pride, to a realization of her tragic fate. However, it is important to note that her self awareness doesn't lead to redemption. The progression of Hattie's character can be analyzed to discuss the theme of moral and emotional growth, or the lack thereof, in the novel. You could argue that while Adam Bede undergoes significant moral growth, Hattie's development is stunted by her pride and self absorption. Themes of social expectations and woman's role. This can come for the exam. Hattie's downfall is tied to her emotional immaturity and the societal pressure on women to uphold moral purity. Her relationship with Arthur Donithron and her subsequent fall from grace reveals the destructive impact of societal expectations on women. Eliot critiques these expectations and explores the limited agency of women in the social context of the time. Next chapter is Pudd'nhead Wilson. In this chapter, final chapter of the actual book, chapter number 20 and 21, and the conclusion, we are going to look at these three chapters of the Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. The story reaches its climax with the revelation of Tom Driscoll's true identity and the resolution of the murder mystery. These chapters highlight the theme of identity, race, and justice. Let's look at the key quotes. Every human, this is also an important quote, every human being carries with him from his cradle to his grave certain physical marks which do not change their character and by which he can always be identified. Pudd'nhead Wilson is the speaker. This quote underscores Wilson's groundbreaking use of fingerprints to identify individuals and solve the mystery of the murder. It reflects his scientific approach and belief in individuality, which is critical to his success in unmasking Tom and proving his own worth to the community. This quote symbolizes the novel's exploration of identity and how it can be uncovered through science challenging the social constructs of race and class. Next, why didn't I learn to work and acquire an honest livelihood? Why did I let you teach me your evil ways? Speaker is Tom Driscoll, actually his valet de chamber. Tom expresses these words to his mother, Roxana, after his crime is exposed and his life is ruined. This moment reflects his regret and self pity as he faces the consequences of his actions. We don't have to write too long, but if it comes for a little longer marks, then we can write all of that. Otherwise, when it comes to just the context or who said and what was the context of that quote, then we can write only the speaker who said and to whom and the context. Tom's lament highlights his unwillingness to take full responsibility for his choices, instead blaming Roxana for his upbringing. It also underscores the moral downfall caused by privilege and deception. It had taken a long time for the town to find it out, but Wilson's splendid vindication of his powers had at last made his name honorable and his opinion valuable. This is narrator, the author. This quote refers to the town's changing perception of Pudd'nhead Wilson after he solves a murder case using his fingerprinting techniques. You are use white now, but you aren't as good as if you had been black, because you, as a ordinary, low down, ordinary, I can't say this word. It says and astrophic. I know what this word is, but I'll skip it. That's what you is. This is a kind of an abuse. So speaker is Roxy. Roxana confronts Tom, her actual son, after his true identity is revealed, angrily chastising him for his deceitful behavior, and moral corruption. This quote reflects the irony and the tragedy of racial identity in the novel. Though Tom has lived his life as a white man, his actions are seen as disgraceful compared to the dignity Roxy associates with her own black identity. They have they had swept places in the cradle, and so their books had their names swept. And from that time till now, no man could say which was which. This is spoken by the narrator, but this is spoken by Pudd'nhead Wilson. The context this revelation comes during the trial when true identities of Tom and Chambers are uncovered. It encapsulates the central twist. This quote ties the theme of nature versus nurture and the social construction of identity, emphasizing how arbitrary circumstances and appearances determine people's lives. Okay, next question is discuss how Pudd'nhead Wilson use of fingerprints symbolize the themes of identity and justice in the novel. Pudd'nhead Wilson's use of fingerprints to solve the murder and reveal the true identities of Tom and Chambers symbolizes the novel's exploration of individuality and the social constructs of identity. The fingerprinting technique highlights the idea the fingerprinting techniques highlights the idea that identity is inherent and unchangeable regardless of external circumstances or societal perceptions. This contrasts with the arbitrary nature of racial and class divisions in Dawson's Landing, where Tom is treated as superior solely because of his assumed whiteness, despite his immoral behavior. This is so nicely explained here. How our society is divided based on race and class, whereas the each person has his own identity based on his fingerprints. It is there, the identity is already there, but we create a separate identity based on race and religion and class divisions. The fingerprints also represent the trump of science and reason over prejudice, as Wilson's method vindicates him after years of being dismissed as a fool. The use of this innovative technique emphasizes Twain's critique of a society that values superficial traits over inherent qualities and fairness. Ultimately, the fingerprints bring justice by exposing the truth, underscoring the novel's themes of morality, equality, equality, and the inescapability of one's true identity. How does Tom's reaction to the revelation of his true identity highlight the theme of moral corruption? Tom's reaction to learning he is actually valet de chamber, a black man by birth, reveals his deep moral corruption and inability to accept responsibility for his actions. Instead of expressing genuine remorse, Tom blames his mother, Roxana, for his behavior, saying, "Why didn't I learn to work and acquire an honest livelihood?" This reflects his refusal to acknowledge his own agency in his downfall. Tom's privileged upbringing as a supposed white man has left him entitled and morally bankrupt. He exploits both his assumed social position and his actual mother, Roxy, for his own gain, showing no gratitude or loyalty. When his true identity is revealed, Tom sees it as a personal tragedy rather than an opportunity for redemption, further emphasizing his selfishness and lack of integrity. Twain uses Tom's reaction to critique the corrupting influence of privilege and the social system that enforces racial inequality. Next question. Analyze Roxana's decision to switch the babies and its consequences for the characters and themes of the novel. Roxana's Roxana's decision to switch her son, valet the chamber, with the real Tom Driscoll is driven by her fear of her son being sold down the river into a life of slavery. This act sets the stage for the novel's central conflict as it upends the social order and leads to tragic consequences. Roxy's choice highlights the desperation and limited agency of enslaved individuals as she takes extreme measures to protect her child. The consequences of these decisions are profound. Chambers, the real Tom, grows up as a submissive servant, while Tom, valet, becomes arrogant and morally corrupt due to his privileged upbringing. The reversal of their fortunes underscores the arbitrariness of racial and class distinctions, as the only thing separating them is perception rather than inherent worth. Twain uses this switch to critique societal constructs of race and privilege, showing how these arbitrary divisions lead to injustice and suffering. Ultimately, the switch reflects the tragic irony of Roxy's attempt to secure her son's future, as her actions contribute to his moral downfall. How does the trial scene serve as the climax of the novel? The trial scene in Pudd'nhead Wilson serves as the climax by resolving the novel's central mysteries and conflicts. Wilson's use of fingerprints to identify the murderer and reveal Tom's true identity is both a dramatic and thematic turning point. It vindicates Wilson, who has been dismissed as an eccentric fool, and exposes the true nature of Tom's character and actions. The trial also brings justice to the murder of Judge Driscoll and unravels the consequences of Roxy's decision to switch the babies. This moment underscores the novel's theme of identity, morality, and justice. The trial reveals the failures of social systems based on race and class, while showcasing the trump of truth and reason. Twain uses this scene to challenge societal prejudices and demonstrate the power of innovation and fairness in addressing human flaws. Next question. What is the significance of the novel's conclusion in addressing the themes of nature versus nurture? The conclusion of Pudd'nhead Wilson emphasizes the interplay between nature and nurture. The revelation that Tom is biologically black but has been raised as white highlights how identity is shaped by both inherent traits and societal influences. Tom's privileged upbringing fosters his arrogance and lack of morality, while Chambers' life as a servant instills humility and obedience. Twain uses this contrast to argue that societal constructs of race and class are arbitrary and destructive. Despite their swept identities, the characters' personalities and fates are largely determined by their social environments. The conclusion reinforces the idea that nurture plays a critical role in shaping individuals, but it also critiques a society that rigidly enforces artificial divisions. Next is chapter 6, Apology by Plato. In Plato's Apology, Socrates delivers a powerful address to the jurors after being found guilty of corrupting the youth and impiety. His speech reflects his unwavering commitment to his principles, his critique of the Athenian justice system, and his views on life and death. Key quotes. This is one of the very beautiful chapters I liked. For the unexamined life is not worth living for men. Speaker is Socrates. Socrates makes this statement while explaining why he cannot abandon his philosophical inquiry, even if it would mean saving his life. He asserts that living a life without seeking truth and wisdom would be meaningless. This quote encapsulates Socrates' philosophy of prioritizing intellectual and moral growth over material or physical survival. It reflects his dedication to the pursuit of virtue and self awareness. It is not difficult to avoid death, gentlemen. It is much more difficult to avoid wickedness, for it runs faster than death. All these quotes are by Socrates only, because this entire chapter he is only the one who is speaking till the very end. After being sentenced to death, Socrates contrasts the fear of death with the moral corruption of one's soul. He implies that the jurors have chosen to commit injustice rather than confront the truth. This quote critiques the jurors' decision, emphasizing Socrates' belief that moral integrity is more important than physical survival. I do not think it right to beg the jury to acquit me, or to do anything else of the sort. It is not only shameful, but also unjust. Speaker is Socrates. Socrates refuses to appeal to the jurors' emotions by pleading for mercy or presenting his family to sway their decision. He argues that justice must be based on truth, not manipulation. This quote demonstrates Socrates' commitment to justice and rationality, even at the cost of his life, and his critique of the Athenian legal system's susceptibility to emotional appeals. Next, a good man cannot be harmed either in life or in death, and his affairs are not neglected by the gods. Speaker is Socrates. Socrates confronts himself and his followers by asserting that true harm only comes from moral corruption, not external misfortunes like death. He expresses faith in divine justice and the protection of virtuous individuals. This quote reflects Socrates' stoic acceptance of his faith and his belief in the immortality of the soul and divine order. Next, To die and be released was better for me, and therefore the oracle gave no sign. Speaker is Socrates. Socrates interprets his death sentence as a form of divine guidance, suggesting that it is preferable for him to die than to live under compromised principles. He believes the gods would have warned him otherwise if his death was unjust. This quote highlights Socrates' trust in the gods and his philosophical view of death as a potential release rather than a punishment. Question. Discuss the significance of Socrates' claim that the unexamined life is not worth living in the context of his defense and philosophy. Socrates' claim that the unexamined life is not worth living is central to his defense and encapsulates his philosophy of seeking truth and virtue. He argues that the purpose of life is to achieve moral and intellectual growth through constant questioning and self reflection. For Socrates, abandoning his philosophical mission to save his life would render his existence meaningless, as it would compromise his principles. This statement is also a critique of Athenian society, which he believes prioritizes wealth, power, and reputation over wisdom and virtue. Socrates' commitment to the examined life serves as a model for his followers, challenging them to live authentically and prioritize self awareness. His insistence on this principle, even at the cost of his life, demonstrates his dedication to his beliefs and underscores the philosophical tension between individual integrity and societal norms. How does Socrates contrast death and wickedness in his speech, and what does this reveal about his values? Socrates contrasts death and wickedness by stating that avoiding moral corruption is far more important than avoiding death. He argues that death is a natural and inevitable part of life, while wickedness represents a failure to live virtuously and harms the soul. By stating it is not difficult to avoid death, it is much more difficult to avoid wickedness. Socrates implies that the jurors, in sentencing him unjustly, have chosen moral failure over the pursuit of justice. This contrast reveals Socrates' values of integrity, justice, and the well being of the soul. He believes that a virtuous life, even if it leads to death, is preferable to a long life compromised by moral wrongdoings. This perspective challenges the jurors and the audience to reconsider their priorities and fear of death, emphasizing the importance of ethical living. Next question. Analyze Socrates' refusal to plead for mercy in his trial. What does this reveal about his view of justice and his character? Socrates' refusal Socrates' refusal to plead for mercy reflects his unwavering commitment to justice and rationality. He argues that appealing to the jurors' emotions through begging or invoking pity would undermine the principles of justice, which should be based on truth and reason rather than sentimentality. By rejecting the idea of bringing his family to court to sway the jury, Socrates upholds his belief that moral integrity is paramount. This decision also reveals Socrates' courage and self respect. He is willing to face the consequences of his actions without compromising his principles, even if it means his death. His stance challenges the Athenian legal system, exposing its susceptibility to emotional manipulation and its failure to prioritize justice over popular opinion. Socrates' actions underscores his role as a philosopher committed to truth and morality regardless of personal cost. What does Socrates' statement, "a good man cannot be harmed either in life or in death," suggest about his views on virtue and the soul? Socrates' assertion that a good man cannot be harmed either in life or in death reflects his belief that true harm comes from moral corruption, not physical suffering or death. For Socrates, virtue and the health of the soul are the highest priorities, and the external events cannot affect the integrity of a virtuous individual. This statement also conveys Socrates' confidence in divine justice, as he believes the gods protect and favor those who live morally. His perspective challenges conventional views of harm, suggesting that societal condemnation or execution does not diminish a person's worth if they maintain their ethical principles. This statement serves to comfort both Socrates and his followers, reinforcing the idea that death is not punishment but a transition, and that living virtuously ensures the soul's well being in this life and beyond. Next question. Examine Socrates' interpretation of his death sentence as a divine sign. How does this reflect his relationship with the gods and his philosophy? Socrates interprets his death sentence as a divine sign, suggesting that the gods have deemed it better for him to die than to live. He notes that the oracle gave no sign of disapproval during his trial, which he takes as confirmation that his fate aligns with divine will. This interpretation reflects Socrates' deep trust in the gods and his belief that they guide and protect virtuous individuals. Philosophically, this view aligns with Socrates' acceptance of death as a natural and potentially positive transition. By framing his death as part of a divine plan, Socrates demonstrates his faith in a higher order and his commitment to living in harmony with it. His perspective challenges societal fears of death, presenting it instead as an opportunity for the soul's release and potential enlightenment. This interpretation reinforces his role as a philosopher dedicated to truth and the divine order. Question. Why did the jury condemn Socrates? The jury condemned Socrates in Plato's Apology primarily because of two charges brought against him: corrupting the youth of Athens and impiety, that is, not believing in the gods of the city and introducing new deities. However, the reasons for his condemnation go beyond the formal accusations and reflect deeper political, social, and cultural tensions in Athens at the time. What are the formal charges? Corrupting the youth. Socrates was accused of influencing young Athenians to question traditional values, authority, and institutions which some saw as undermining the stability of Athenian society. His association with controversial figures and his encouragement of critical thinking made him a target for those who feared change. His philosophical method of questioning, the Socratic method, often exposed ignorance in powerful figures, leading to resentment. Impiety. Socrates was accused of not believing in the gods of the city and introducing new spiritual beliefs or deities. Daimonion, Daimonion, a divine inner voice that guided him. This charge painted him as a threat to the religious tradition that were central to Athenian identity. What are the underlying reasons? Socrates was linked directly or indirectly to individuals associated with the oligarchic rule of the 30 tyrants, such as Critias and Alcibiades. Although Socrates himself did not endorse their actions, his association with these figures made him a convenient scapegoat for the societal unrest following Athenians' defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Challenge to traditional values. Socrates questioned the moral and intellectual authority of Athens' leaders, exposing their ignorance and hypocrisy. His philosophical inquiry was seen as subversive, challenging traditional norms and undermining respect for established authority. Democratic resentment. Athens had a fragile democracy, and Socrates' criticism of democratic practices and his apparent preference for governance by the wise rather than the majority were viewed as elites and undemocratic. This created animosity among the jurors who were ordinary citizens chosen by lot. Many Athenians misunderstood Socrates' philosophical approach and intentions. He was often parodied in popular plays such as Aristophanes' The Clouds as a sophist who used rhetoric to deceive and corrupt. This negative public perception contributed to his unpopularity. The jury's decision. The jury was composed of 501 Athenian citizens who were likely influenced by Socrates' unapologetic demeanor during the trial. His refusal to pander to the jury or beg for mercy, which many saw as arrogance. His suggestion that he deserved a reward rather than punishment, which insulted the jury. The broader context of political instability and a desire to restore traditional values. Socrates was found guilty by a narrow margin, 280 guilty to 221 not guilty, and sentenced to death. His defiance during the penalty phase, where he refused to propose an acceptable punishment, likely swayed more jurors to vote for the death penalty. Socrates' response. Socrates accepted the verdict with calmness, viewing his condemnation as a reflection of the jury's ignorance and a result of his commitment to philosophical inquiry. He believed it was better to die unjustly than to compromise his principles, famously stating, "It is not difficult to avoid death, it is much more difficult to avoid wickedness." This stance cemented his legacy as a martyr for truth and integrity. Write a short essay on Greek trial. The Greek trial talks about Socrates only. The Greek trial, a glimpse into the ancient Athenian justice. The trial of Socrates in 399 BCE is one of the most famous legal proceedings in history, offering profound insights into the justice system of ancient Athens and its cultural values. This trial, as documented in Plato's Apology, provides a window into the functioning of democracy, the role of law, and the societal tensions that defined Athens during its golden age. Athenian legal system. Ancient Athens had a unique and participatory legal system deeply rooted in its democratic ethos. Jurors were ordinary citizens chosen by lot with large panels, often numbering 500 or more, to ensure fairness and prevent corruption. Trials were swift, typically lasting a single day, with strict time limits on speeches by both the prosecution and the defense. There were no professional judges or lawyers. Instead, citizens presented their cases directly. This system emphasized civic participation but was vulnerable to public opinion, emotional appeals, and potential mob rule. Socrates' trial. Socrates' trial epitomizes the strengths and weaknesses of this system. Charged with corrupting the youth and impiety, Socrates faced a jury of 501 citizens. His trial highlighted a tension between individual freedom and collective values in Athenian democracy. While the charges were ostensibly legal, they masked deeper societal anxieties about Socrates, philosophical critiques of authority, tradition, and democracy itself. Socrates' defense showcased his commitment to truth and virtue even in the face of death. Rejecting conventional legal strategies, he refused to plead for mercy or appeal to the jury's emotions. Instead, he argued that his philosophical mission was a divine duty, essential for the moral health of Athens. His defiance and his suggestion that he deserved a reward rather than punishment likely antagonized the jury, leading to his condemnation by a narrow margin. The Athenian trial process reflected the ideals of direct democracy, giving every citizen a voice in matters of justice. It fostered accountability and active civic engagement. However, it also exposed vulnerabilities. The lack of professional oversight allowed for biases and emotional manipulation, as seen in Socrates' case. Public trials often become arenas for political and personal vendettas, where societal tensions could influence legal outcomes. Legacy. The trial of Socrates has transcended in its historical moment, symbolizing the enduring conflict between the individual conscience and societal norms. It underscores the challenges of balancing freedom of thought with communal stability in any legal system. Socrates' willingness to die for his principle transformed his trial into a defining moment in the history of philosophy and justice. In conclusion, the Greek trial system exemplified the democratic ideals of ancient Athens, but also revealed the fragility of justice when swayed by public sentiment. The trial of Socrates remains a powerful reminder of the importance of protecting intellectual freedom and moral integrity within any system of law. Next question. Meaning of the term inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is a method of logical thinking that involves making generalizations based on specific observations or evidence. It moves from particular instances to broader generalizations or conclusions. Unlike deductive reasoning, which starts with a general premise and applies it to specific cases, inductive reasoning begins with specific details and works towards forming a general principle or theory. Key features of inductive reasoning. Observation based. It starts with specific observations or real life examples. For example, noticing that the sun has risen in the east every day so far. Second, generalization. It involves forming a broader conclusion based on the observations. Example, concluding that the sun always rises in the east. Third, probabilistic. Inductive reasoning does not guarantee certainty but increases the likelihood of the conclusion being true. Example, even if the sun has always risen in the east, there is no absolute guarantee it always will in the future. Explanatory. Often used to develop hypotheses, theories, or predictions in scientific and philosophical context. Examples of inductive reasoning. Scientific observation. All swans I have seen so far are white. Conclusion, all swans are white. This conclusion is subject to revision if a black swan is found. In everyday reasoning, we say, my friend has been late to every meeting this week. Conclusion, my friend is often late or he will be late for this meeting also. Where is inductive reasoning applied? In law, I'll cover the law part. Drawing inferences from evidences or witness testimonies. Inductive reasonings are not certain and they also depend on the quality of the evidence. So, in summary, inductive reasoning is a foundational method for building knowledge, especially in uncertain contexts. But its conclusions require careful evaluation and testing for reliability. We'll close this video here, and from the next video onwards, we'll start from chapter 7 till chapter 13. Thank you very much for staying around and listening to such a long video. I hope some of these questions do come in your exam paper and help you to score marks in them. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye bye. And best of luck for your exams. Take care.